In this video, Magnus Carlsen is going to obliterate his grandmaster opponent, Christopher Yoo. And when I say obliterate, I mean obliterate. This game is ugly. If you want to see, a crazy beatdown featuring the GOAT, Magnus Carlsen, this video is for you. Let's dive right in. All right, in the game, Magnus opens 1d4, and his opponent, Christopher Yoo, goes knight f6, heading straight for a queen's gambit decline after the moves c4, e6, knight f3, and then finally d5. This is the queen's gambit decline, and it is arguably the most popular way for black to play against 1d4 at the highest level. Now, of course, white here has the option. You can go knight c3 or g3 in the spirit of the Catalan opening, but in this game, Magnus does go knight c3, the three knights variation, named after those three knights, and this is Magnus Carlsen's old favorite way to combat the queen's gambit decline. Now here, black, of course, has a million different options. For example, bishop b7, bishop b4, c6, c5, knight d7, a6, h6, and also d takes c4 as played in the game are all playable here. And this move, d takes c4, is called the Vienna variation, and it is one of the more combative choices against 1d4. And actually, Gukesh just played this opening as black against... who was it? Was it Anish Giri? I forget who it was. He literally just played it in the 2025 Tata Steel tournament, and it was a crazy game. And here is Magnus Carlsen's opponent, Christopher Yoo, also playing it. What is the idea? Well, you win that pawn on c4 immediately and challenge white to regain it. So here, white goes e4, threatening bishop takes e4, and now black does go bishop b4 in the spirit of the Rogozin variation of the QGD or even the Nimzo Indian. The point being, you are pinning that knight on c3 to the king on e1, therefore threatening knight takes e4. That would be a very good move. Now here, white has the option of going for a gambit line with the move bishop takes c4, allowing knight takes e4. That is thought to be the most dangerous line at the highest level these days, but instead here, Magnus does go bishop g5. That is the old line here, and now here, black has a choice. The main line of the Vienna starts with the move c5. That leads to very complicated lines. Beyond that, you can also go b5, trying to hang on to that extra pawn on c4, or the move played by Christopher Yoo in the game. That is the move h6, putting pressure on the bishop on g5. Now here, Magnus, he does trade on f6. Bishop takes, queen takes, and then here, bishop takes c4, winning back that lost pawn. But now here, Magnus does have two very strong pawns on d4 and e4, and those pawns will give him the chance to fight for an opening advantage. He may even go e5 in the near future, driving back that queen on f6. All right, now here, Christopher Yoo, he's no dummy. He knows his theory. He goes c5, counterattacking in the center immediately. Magnus castles, that is the main line. Black takes on d4, and now here, the main line for white is e5, and that was played in the game. So e5, ignoring the threat on the knight on c3, instead counterattacking on the queen on f6 immediately. Now here, the queen must go back. Queen d8 played in the game by Christopher Yoo. And now here, the main line for white and the strongest move is actually you leave the pawn on d4, and instead you just go knight to e4, jumping up with the knight, threatening ideas like perhaps knight d6 later in the game. Now, instead of that here, Magnus plays a move that is very, very rare and actually a little bit dubious. He goes knight takes d4, winning back that pawn on d4 immediately. And now here, the reason this is dubious is white really has to attack the black king immediately. After all, that pawn on e5 could be a weakness later in the game. And beyond that, black here has those two b's on b4 and c8. That means if white does not attack, those two b's will be too strong, the pawn on e5 will be too weak, and Christopher will take over. So here, Magnus already putting himself in a very difficult position. All right, Christopher, he castles, short castles. White goes queen g4, developing his queen, threatening ideas on g7 maybe later in the game. And now here, Christopher, in this position, all he has to do to have an excellent game as black is just go queen to c7. That is by far the strongest move here for black. It's the right move. It's the right continuation. However, he doesn't play that. Instead, right here, he actually plays the move knight to d7, and this move is a critical mistake. I cannot emphasize that enough. I mean, just look at that eval bar, just skyrocket after knight d7. It goes from a little bit favor for black to just dominating for white in one single move. Now, if you like puzzles, pause the video right now and try to figure out what the heck went wrong for black right here, and what is white gonna do about it on the very next move. And while you're at it, go and smash that YouTube like button for more videos just like this one. All right, of course, the key idea here for white, this is a shocker. I mean, look at all of these pieces piled up on the pawn on e6. You know a sacrifice is coming, and in the game, the GOAT, Magnus Carlsen, goes knight takes e6, giving up the knight. What is the idea? Well, it's very, very simple. If you take on e6, as played in the game, f takes e6. Well, first of all, if you don't, you lose the rook or the queen. That is no good. So black does take, and now we have bishop takes e6, and look at this. The double attack on the king and the bishop on b4 that is hanging. That means white is going to win material right here, right now. All right, king h8 played in the game, and then of course, queen takes b4, and look at this. Magnus is literally up 2 pawns for free on the king side, plus he's more active, plus he's got the attack. I mean, this is just brutal. All right, here black fights back, knight takes e5, winning one of those pawns back, a good decision, but here Magnus, he doesn't even bother defending the bishop on e6. Instead, the GOAT, what does he do? He goes rook a d1, piling up pressure on the queen on d8. I mean, comment down below if you're just amazed by Magnus Carlsen so far in this game, playing just flawless chess. All right, now the queen on d8 must move. Queen to e8 played in the game, getting it out of the attack by the rook, but Magnus is not done. He drops back, bishop d5, piling up pressure on the pawn on b7. This man is just relentless. All right, here, it turns out the best way for black to defend, he has to go knight c6, dropping back the knight, defending b7 by blockading the attack of the bishop on b7. However, instead, bishop f5 played in the game. Christopher Yoo trying to stay active. He's giving up that pawn on b7 to try and get counterplay, but Magnus, he is just all over it. Now here, technically queen takes b7 is the strongest move immediately, threatening queen takes a8. However, instead, rook f e1 played in the game, pinning that knight on e5 to the queen, and now the threat honestly could be f4, again, piling up pressure on that pin piece. All right, here, what is black going to do about it? Well, the strongest way forward is bishop c2, a very bizarre looking move, putting pressure on the rook on d1, opening up the attack on f2. Instead, knight d3 played in the game. Now, this move looks very obvious. After all, you are opening up that double attack on the queen and the rook on e1. However, of course, Magnus here, he just trades on e8, rook takes e8, then we have knight takes b4, winning back that queen. Of course, if you take the rook, say rook a takes d8, then the queen can move anywhere it wants, queen d4, and so on. It lives. That would be game over. Therefore, you must take on b4, knight takes b4. Now we have rook takes a8. Very important. You can take either rook with the rook, but if you take on f8, then black's a rook takes on f8, and that rook suddenly is decently active. Instead, you take on a8 to deflect the other rook all the way to a8. I mean, Magnus, he knows everything about these little minutia details here. Now, finally, you do take on b7. Bishop takes b7, winning yet another pawn, and in this position and in the endgame in general, Magnus will be up 2 pawns on f2 and b2. Can Christopher Yoo even hope to hang on in this Title Tuesday game? I mean, not to mention the fact he's down on the clock. He's down in material, down on the clock, 1 minute and 10 seconds versus the 2 minutes and 3 seconds. This is getting ugly. All right, the rook on a8 is under attack. Rook b8 played in the game. Very logical. Now, bishop f3, sliding back the bishop to the best square. Now, knight d3. The knight jumps in, piling up pressure on b2. White goes b3, defending b2. There will be no lost pawns for free in this game. All right, rook c8, piling up pressure on c3. Christopher Yoo continues to fight back. Now we have knight d5, jumping up with the knight. Now bishop h7 retreats the bishop back to a very safe square. Now we have knight e3, and here, get a load of this. Magnus has set up some sort of like indestructible fortress. I mean, his knight on e3 defends the rook. The bishop defends the rook. Everything is defended by the pawns. I mean, literally everything here of Magnus is being defended more than sufficiently. And overall, that just means it's going to be almost impossible for Christopher Yoo to set up any sort of weird tactical idea. All right, he tries rook c1, flying in with the rook, trying to stay active, but now bishop e2, a cold-blooded move, putting pressure on that knight on d3. Now we have rook takes d1, knight takes d1, maintaining the attack on the knight. Now knight c1, piling up pressure on the bishop and the pawn on a2, but here and white just goes knight c3, defending both squares, a2 and e2. Again, a very cold-blooded move by the GOAT. All right, now bishop b1, play by Christopher. Surprisingly, he is fighting on. And what is the idea behind this move? Well, he's threatening bishop takes a2. And the point is, if you take the bishop, you give up the defense of the other bishop. And that is what happens. We have knight takes b1, knight takes e2, hits the king, king to f1, and then knight to f4. And now here, finally, we have the endgame where Magnus has one extra pawn on the queen side, one extra pawn on the king side. And knight endgames are notoriously easy to win when you are up material, in contrast to rook endgames, which are much harder. So here, the GOAT should have no problem finishing off this game, but let's watch as the greatest endgame player of all time does his magic. All right, g3 played in the game, knight d5, getting the knight out of the attack, then king e2, g5. Christopher, he is fighting on till the very bitter end, gaining space. All right, king d2, king g7, knight c3, offering the knight trade. Of course, if you trade knights, that would be game over on the spot. White pushes the pawn on the queen side, the king tries to defend, then you go on the king side. I mean, there are just too many weaknesses to defend. So in the game, knight b4, keeping the knights on the board and pressuring a2. Now a3, knight c6, king e3, king f6, king e4, king e6, knight b5, pressuring a7. What does Christopher do? He goes knight a5, ignoring a7, instead pressuring the b3 pawn. All right, knight d4 hits the king, king d6, f4, gaining space on the king side. Now g takes f4, g takes, and knight b7. Now knight f5 hits the king, king e6, b4, a5, offering the trade of pawns. And here white ignores that and just takes yet another pawn on h6. This is getting ugly. I told you Magnus would be obliterating Christopher Yoo in this game. All right, a takes, knight d6, hits the king, king d4, king f6, king d5, knight b5, king c5, knight c3. Now b5. Can black even hope to stop that pawn on b5? Let's see. King g6. He counterattacks on the other knight, making things very complicated for the GOAT. Now knight g4 defends. King f5 again attacks it. h3 again defends it. King takes f4. He wins back one of those pawns, but now b6, that passed b pawn, is marching down the board. Now knight a4, threatening to win the pawn. King c6, knight takes, king g3, threatening the pawn. And here, one last move for the GOAT. If you like puzzles, again, pause the video. Even if you are a beginner, you should be able to find this move right here. And of course, the key move for the GOAT, the last real move of the game, is knight to f2, the cold-blooded move, defending the pawn on h3. And the point is, if you take the knight, then you move the pawn to h4, and that pawn becomes unstoppable. But if you don't take the knight, the king marches over, and that will be way too much. So here, Christopher, in a show of good sportsmanship, he takes the knight, and Magnus plays one last move, h4. Now the king is outside the square of the pawn, this being the square, and here, the king, it can't get inside. If he goes king g3, white again moves h5, and you cannot stop the pawn. Therefore, in this position right here, with 3 seconds left on the clock, Christopher Yoo resigns to Magnus Carlsen. He knows he got obliterated in this game, and there's no shame in that. After all, Magnus is the GOAT. However, I do want to point out his mistake of knight to d7 in this position instead of queen c7. That is a very serious tactical mistake. Again, knight d7 was met by knight takes e6. The point being f takes, bishop takes, with the double attack on the king on g8 and the bishop on b4. I mean, that is just unforgivable in this position. So wow, what a game between Magnus and Christopher Yoo in this insane blitz game from Titled Tuesday on January 21st, 2025. All right, Chess YouTube, hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, smash that like button for me. Thank you so much for doing that. Helps me out a ton. And while you're at it, check out this video right here. Let's see. How about this one right here, where Magnus invents a brand new opening against Hikaru Nakamura? If you want to see Magnus invent a literal brand new chess opening, check that video out, and I'll see you in the next video.